Just a quick note at the front end, the majority of this video was shot and edited before the airing of the episode Rogue, which featured this. So if you were expecting a spotlight on that, it's not really here. Because believe it or not, this is a big topic even before that happened. All right, that's good. Now for the usual preamble. This is your reminder that the BBC has yet to address the consistent transphobic leanings in its news coverage, and while the team behind Doctor Who is not connected to this in any way since this is a BBC-owned property, I'm going to keep pointing it out until the problem gets resolved. Links in a pinned comment below if you don't know what I'm talking about. I'll stop saying it when it stops being a problem. You know, I legitimately found myself wondering, what is the gayest sonic screwdriver I could use for this opening? It wasn't this one. It's this one. I'm not sure how I feel about that joke, but hell with it. We're going with it. Hey, folks, it is Pride Month, and we're also getting new Doctor Who episodes, so I'm just going to marry the two. Now, this is not my first time talking about Queerness and Doctor Who. I've talked about it a number of times across the years. I talked about it years ago, before I was presenting like this and look the way that I do. Way back when I talked about the character of Bill and how she was perceived by certain members of the audience. Since then, I've also talked about the 12th Doctor and how his particular journey over the 3 series that Peter Capaldi played the part really spoke to me and to my queer experience in particular. This time, I want to do something a little bit more broad because, yeah, if you hadn't noticed, the culture war vultures, while it's not the only turn of phrase that they use to belittle the current era of Doctor Who, they will very freely point out or imply that the show's gotten real gay. And that's obviously a very bad thing. But just how gay is this show? And I don't mean now. I mean, like, historically. Has it gotten gayer? How much gayer has it gotten? Is this a recent thing, or did this actually happen a while back? Has it been sudden jumps? Has it been a gradient? Well, why don't we talk about the history of queerness and Doctor Who? This is not going to be comprehensive, because for it to be comprehensive, it would have to take into account a couple of things that I don't think my ADHD-addled brain would be able to wrangle and get all the information that I would need to do those aspects justice. So I am not going to be talking very much about either the identities of the people involved in the show. That will come up a few times where I think it's especially worth noting. But I feel like things can get dicey when my main focus is usually on what is the show actually depicting and whether or not people behind the scenes were not cisgender or not heterosexual or what have you, that if that didn't show up on screen, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter at all, but that's a lot harder for me to parse, specifically as somebody who just cares a lot more about the finished product than the process that went into it, more often than not, so long as that process is not abusive. That's an important exception to make. The other thing that I'm only going to bring up a couple of times is going to be ancillary media, because Doctor Who has a lot of side content. There are novels, there are comics, there is the comic strip that ran in Doctor Who magazine. There's audio adventures, so many audio adventures. Even beyond original novels, there's novelizations of stories that actually aired, which have additional details and more depth and more lore. And I don't have the spoons. I can't. So I am going to focus primarily on what was actually depicted in the show. Again, I will touch on behind the scenes or creators or some folks' identities at a few places where I feel it is particularly relevant. And there will be a number of points at which I will bring up ancillary media. But I'm not going to dig into those areas very much. Partially for the sake of my own brain, partially because that's getting into some very niche stuff and it could easily eat up the majority of the time of this video when I know most of the audience only watches the show. I'm not... I appreciate that people have some very deep love for, the novels or Big Finish and whatnot. I love some of that stuff too, but just grant me there's a lot. So I'm going to be breaking this whole thing up into 4 distinct eras, some of which I'm going to spend more time on than others. First, we have the classic era, starting in 1963 with the airing of the original episode of Doctor Who, An Unearthly Child, and running through 1989 with the airing of the final part of Survival. Now, technically, the show was not canceled at that point. It was put on hiatus. It just didn't come back for a very long time. That brings us to the Wilderness years. There was an attempt to revive the show with a TV movie done in the 90s starring Paul McGann, but that did not revive the show, and that was a period in which ancillary media was pretty much all there was. Big Finish started doing audio adventures in that time with some classic era doctors, and then pretty soon after starting up, bringing in Paul McGann to continue his adventures as well. And then we hit the revival era, which runs from 2005 with Russell T Davies coming in to start things off with the 9th Doctor, Christopher Eccleston, running through, let's say, 2023. And for lack of a better way to put it, we'll call this the new Doctor Who. Now, people use New Who to mean the start of the revival. I'm not in this case because I don't know what else to call this. I don't want to call it the Disney era. I know some people do, but I don't like assigning Disney that much power. I'm not trying to downplay Disney's influence. They do have some, but I also don't think they have nearly as much as certain people, especially people who are frequently complaining about certain aspects, want to claim they have over this thing. Disney does not own Doctor Who, but it is starting to air on Disney Plus, and that began with the specials with David Tennant returning as the 14th Doctor in 2023. So there's our eras: classic, wilderness, revival, new. So let's start digging into this. It shouldn't be any real big surprise that there was really no explicit inclusion of LGBTQIA plus characters or explicit theming in the classic era, because homosexuality didn't even start getting decriminalized in the UK until 1967. And it didn't get decriminalized in all parts of that country until 1982. And by that point, we were on our 5th actor playing the Doctor. Peter Davison was in the role by then. So it really isn't reasonable to expect that there would have been much in the way of clear queer representation during the classic era, because even once homosexuality was no longer criminalized, it was still looked down on and taboo, and not something that was broached very much at all in mainstream media in the UK. That having been said, we do have a couple things to talk about. I said I wouldn't talk too much about behind-the-scenes individuals, but you know what? It would be remiss of me not to mention that the man who directed the very first episode of Doctor Who, a man named Waris Hussein, who is gay. Given some of the claims of people these days about all the forced representation and these diversity hires, both in front of and behind the camera, you know what? First director ever for this show was a gay man of color. That is a fact, and nothing you will ever do will ever change that. But as things went on across the season, there were some things that, let's just go with, had a gay energy to them. Sometimes with some specific characters, and sometimes it may or may not have been intentional, but there are some things along the way. I don't want to dwell too much on the classic era, largely because it kind of involves me reading into things a bit, but here's a few things that I feel like highlighting. During the Tom Baker story, Stones of Blood, there's a character named Professor Rumsford. Now, she's played by Beatrix Lehman, and she has an energy to her. Now, whether that was intended in the character or if that is just something inherent to the actress, who, from what I can tell, was a not particularly closeted bisexual woman. Well, I say bisexual, sources are a little bit mixed on this. Some say lesbian, some say bisexual. I'm going with bisexual just because that seemed to come up more often in the things that I could find, but the actual documentation of this is not great, but woman had an energy. I'm sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry. She just does.
I do have my academic reputation to consider.
Similarly, you have this pair of characters from the 7th Doctor story, Paradise Towers, and you will never, ever, ever convince me that these two cannibalistic pensioners are not living together in a happy, loving relationship where they trick young people into their apartment to eat them.
You're a thin little thing, aren't you? Oh, but never mind, dear. Tilda and I will feed you up, won't we?
The 7th Doctor's era was actually pretty political in a lot of ways, and in the episode Happiness Patrol, which is a very blatant swipe at the Thatcher administration, there is a man who is, well, who is killed by the stand-in for that administration, and while it is not particularly dwelled upon, he does have a pink triangle. And if you did not know, pink triangles have an association with gay people from back when homosexuals were forced to wear them when put into concentration camps by Germany, leading up to and during World War II. There is a more specific word for the people who ran those kinds of camps, but it begins with N. You know what it is, and YouTube gets weirdly touchy about that word sometimes, but we'll move on. Given how political that episode is in general, I have a hard time believing that that is by accident. And in the very last story, there is the relationship between the Doctor's companion Ace and the character of Kara. Now, this is not made explicit within the show, but there is an energy, and some accounts say that it was there intentionally. And this is a case, as with a few others, where the novelizations of these stories would flesh this out a little bit. Again, generally not make it explicit, but drop in some more hints, some more references than might have made it into the show. It would be during the wilderness years that we would start getting explicit representation in some of the media outside of the show itself, because obviously the show wasn't running, including the novel Damaged Goods by one Russell T. Davies. Now, if you weren't already aware, RTD, who we will get to again when we get to the revival of the show, and who is now running the show again for this newest era, is an out and proud gay man. And this is a case where that feels a massive omission to not mention. But yes, he started putting in explicit representation in written prose works dealing with Doctor Who. He was not the only one to do that, but again, I don't have the spoons to try and get comprehensive about that. Let's get to the revival era, started up by the aforementioned RTD, and we kick things off with something that is still debated to this day, in fact. Arguably the first trans character of the show, that being the villain, Cassandra, from the very second episode of the revival era, The End of the World. She makes mention of having been a young boy at one point.
My home will die. That's where I used to live when I was a little boy, down there.
Now, this is mostly taken as canon at this point, but for a long time this was hotly debated as to whether this was meant to indicate that Cassandra is in fact a trans character and did used to be a boy, or if rather this is meant to indicate that she has had so many surgeries to get her to the point where she is that she actually does not even remember at all what her original body was even like, and also doesn't care because she doesn't look back, she looks forward at the maintaining of her impossibly thin self. Now, this is something that's gonna come up again. I unfortunately can't provide you with concrete examples of a lot of stuff that went on in fan forums during the front end of the revival era because a lot of that stuff's gone. Now, it would be an overstatement to say that I was there from the very beginning, but I got into Doctor Who while the third series was airing. I actually was catching up on it during then. I started watching it as it aired during series 4. But during series 3, I started going to fan forums. Outpost Gallifrey kind of being the big one at the time. But I can't go back and pull the examples of what I know I saw. And things like arguments about Cassandra were stuff going on there. And as well as some reactions to some other stuff, which I don't love the fact that my source basically amounts to, trust me, bro, but it is what it is. I was there. I know what I saw. If you choose to think I'm lying, I'm surprised you got this far into the video then. Moving past Cassandra, we get to Captain Jack Harkness, played by the now somewhat controversial John Barrowman, and I don't want to get into all that, but short version is he had a rather lengthy documented history of believing that showing his junk off on the set of various projects that he worked on, including Doctor Who, was a real funny joke, and it's not. And that eventually came back around and bit him in the rear end. So we're gonna leave that aspect of it alone. I've done other full videos on it. I guess that's the one I'll go with. So anyways, moving on. Captain Jack Harkness was a character from a future point in history, and he is, I think, either bisexual or pansexual could work. I actually rather prefer the term omnisexual for him, given that his proclivities are basically anybody of mature age and generally humanoid, more or less. He's flirted with robots, with aliens, with men, with women. He's down to clown with pretty much anybody.
Am I naked in front of millions of viewers?
Absolutely.
Ladies, your viewing figures just went up.
And again, to bring up those forums, while he will often these days be framed by people who don't like the current direction of the show as somebody that, like, well, people always love Jack, but that did it right, and here it's much more blatant and in your face. Like, if you think that, you either weren't there, weren't paying attention, or you were, and you're lying. Because people absolutely did not like Jack. Now, I think the majority of viewers did like Jack. Jack is a lot of fun, and he is a wonderful presence on the show. But, boy, people did absolutely complain about him, both in general as a presence and as time went on, and he got his own spin-off of Torchwood, where eventually the character would be shown far more often with men than with anybody else, eventually settling into a long-term relationship with another male character. And I remember people on those forums complaining that, you know what, he used to be all about anybody, but now it's just all gay stuff.
I gotta go meet a girl, but you got an excellent bottom too.
Again, I wish I could show this to you, but it is gone. But it was there. I'll touch on Torchwood briefly because that spin-off show, which again, starred Jack Harkness as its primary character, had a number of same-sex interactions, some as one-off, some as ongoing. The other major one worth noting, other than Jack and Yanto, is a semi-recurring villainous character played by James Marsters called John Hart. And yeah, so that happened.
Goodbye. Okay.
It is worth noting on Torchwood, because it aired at a later time, they were allowed to have more explicitly romantic interactions like that. You would have quick moments in Doctor Who, but they tended to be very fleeting, whereas Torchwood was able to linger on it. Boy, do I wish Torchwood was a better show overall, but if we're talking representation, I gotta mention that. There would be other moments and hints across even the early revival era. In the second series, we had William Shakespeare, the Bard himself, appearing to flirt with David Tennant as the 10th Doctor.
Oh. Come on, we can have a good flirt later.
Is that a promise, Doctor? Oh, 57 academics just punched the air.
Also, the very next series, Series 3, featured this lovely couple in the episode of Gridlock, who are very explicitly married.
You know full well we're not sisters. We're married.
Series 4 would feature the fan-favorite episode Midnight, in which the character of Sky Silvestri, who gets taken over by something referred to by the fandom as the Midnight Entity, we never really know what it is explicitly shown to be married to a woman prior to everything just going to hell.
I found myself single rather recently, not by choice. She needed her own space, as they say. A different galaxy, in fact.
Coming back to the world of spin-offs, I mentioned Torchwood, but there was also another spin-off aimed at a younger audience. So Doctor Who was often billed as an all-ages family show. Torchwood was for a more mature audience, often mature in a very sophomoric sense, but still. And then there was the other spin-off, The Sarah Jane Adventures, featuring Elizabeth Sladen, who was a companion to the Fourth Doctor and was reintroduced to the show during its second series once it was revived. And as the character of Sarah Jane Smith, she was the star of The Sarah Jane Adventures, which was aimed at a younger audience than the main show. And there was an intention to bring a gay relationship into that. She had an adopted son named Luke, and the intention was for the show to have him go off to college and start dating his male roommate. This, unfortunately, was not able to come to pass because Elizabeth Sladen passed away and the show was subsequently ended. However, it did get an acknowledgement in a piece put out during Doctor Who lockdown in the earlier days of COVID called Farewell Sarah Jane, where a number of actors in character talk of their love of Sarah Jane Smith as if it was a funeral. And this includes the character of Luke. And it also makes very explicit the relationship that was intended to happen within the show.
She's the one who told me to go and talk to him. And now we've been married for 5 years.
This particular short also features a mention of two classic era companions, Nyssa and Tegan, now living together in Australia. There would be other small mentions across RTD's original time as showrunner in episodes like Waters of Mars, but eventually he would leave the show and Stephen Moffat took over, kicking off with the inauguration of the 11th Doctor, played by Matt Smith. In Series 6, we had the recurrent character of Canton Delaware, who is confirmed to be gay in the episode The Day of the Moon.
This person you want to marry, black. Yes. Perhaps I'm a little more liberal. He is.
In the episode A Good Man Goes to War, we are introduced to this lovely couple, Jenny Flint and Madame Vastra. Madame Vastra being a Silurian, a reptilian people from the dawn of time on Earth, most of whom are asleep underground, but she is awake above ground and very much in love with this woman.
I don't know why you put up with me.
I'll also throw in the character of Strax there. Now, I don't want to imply that Strax is like part of a throuple situation. I would actually say you could probably very safely read Strax as asexual, not only because he's a Sontaran and they reproduce asexually anyway, but I don't think he even knows what sex is. He actually fairly reliably does not distinguish between genders in any way, shape, or form, and he's kind of delightful, usually. He can be overused sometimes, but I find him fun.
Silence, boy! That's Strax, and as you can see, he's easily confused. Silence, girl! Sorry, lad.
There's some little teasing hints with the companion character of Amy Pond, where she definitely, at the very least, shows a distinct interest in herself.
Do I really look like that? Yeah. Yeah, you do.
Pond flirting with herself.
But as we move towards the next companion, that of Clara Oswald, an earlier introduction of her with the character of Oswin, it's complicated if you don't know how all that happened. Clara kind of reappears several times as characters who actually died before joining the show proper, and all of those kind of are her, but are also variants of her, but it's generally probably pretty safe to assume that they are all largely representative of her as a person, and the first one that we meet has, well, some distinct tones of bisexuality.
First boy I ever fancied was called Rory.
Okay.
Actually, she was called Nina. I was going through a phase.
This would appear to be confirmed by Clara herself after she began traveling with the 12th Doctor, Peter Capaldi, when she would say this in front of a class of students.
Jane Austen. Amazing writer, brilliant comic observer, and strictly amongst ourselves, a phenomenal kisser.
Speaking of class, it was at this point in time that we had another Doctor Who spinoff called Class, which I haven't seen. But I do know that there is a same-sex relationship between two of the lead characters.
I love you.
After Clara stopped traveling with the Doctor, we got the introduction of Bill Potts. And one of the first things we find out about her is, in fact, that she is gay.
My first day here, in the canteen, I was on chips. There was this girl, student, beautiful, like a model, only with talking and thinking.
Now, as I said, I have actually talked about Bill before years and years ago. But this is where I really started to notice the ramping up of the, nobody complained about Captain Jack because it was okay because they did it better, but this time it's so in your face. This was really where that started ramping up. And again, that is complete ignoring of what the actual conversations going on at the time with Jack were, and also just completely disingenuous. Again, that earlier video I did is still fully accurate in terms of the information it gives of how often Bill actually brings up her sexuality. Spoiler for that video, I suppose. If you want the actual numbers, you can go check that out. But she does not bring it up any more than most companions. Actually, when compared to the straight companions and how often those companions brought up their straight sexual relationships or their straight attractions, she came in about average, right in the middle. When Stephen Moffat eventually stopped running the show, we then got Chris Chibnall, who ran the show for Jodie Whittaker's 13th Doctor's run. And the Chibnall era would continue some fairly casual representation. We had the character of Angstrom in The Ghost Monument, the second episode of that run. The characters of Adam and Jake and Praxius. The character of Yaz, but stick a pin in Yaz, we'll get back to her, but because there were also some stumbling points. Chibnall had a rather unfortunate tendency to, well, to say it's explicitly bury your gays is a little bit of a overstatement. That is the practical upshot of what happened. But he had a tendency to try to assign characters that were fodder and were just there to die, just assign them some single trait or aspect to them, and then theoretically we would care more when they die. Doesn't play out in practice, but that ended up giving us some things like the death of this unnamed guard in the episode Resolution, or the character of Frankie in Arachnids in the UK, where basically the only thing we know about her is that she's gay.
I'm your niece's wife, sir.
Exactly.
And then she is eaten by spiders. Now, I don't want to paint that as specifically a Chibnall problem, because this did happen earlier as well. A particularly egregious example under Moffat is in Good Man Goes to War, which introduced Vastra and Jenny, but also unfortunately gave us this couple described only as the fat one and the skinny one, and the fact that they're a couple.
We're the thin, fat, gay, married Anglican Marines. Why would we need names as well?
And the fat one dies as part of the cold open, and there is never any acknowledgement of that. That's never picked up on again. And we don't even know if his husband ever found out what happened to him. So that's not great. But I don't want to let Russell T Davies off the hook either, because in the very first season, in the episode Aliens in London, we had Rose Tyler saying to the Ninth Doctor this.
It hurts. It's so gay.
That's, just to be clear, wasn't super okay at the time. Like, I'm not going to say you couldn't make an argument that it is something that a young person who is meant to be a little bit more of a street smart kind of character, not particularly posh or anything like that, might actually say that at that point in time. But like, dude. So coming back to the character of Yaz, who I said we would stick a pin in, let's take that pin out and take a look at what we've got. Yasmin Khan was confirmed to have romantic feelings for Jodie Whittaker's 13th Doctor in the special Eve of the Daleks. This would be followed up in the following special, Legend of the Sea Devils, and then they would have a parting in the final episode of that era, The Power of the Doctor. This... okay, let's set aside for a minute my own personal feelings on how well or poorly the actual relationship was depicted. I have a lot of criticisms of a lot of Chibnall's era, but what I will grant is that some of these moments and scenes are actually some of the better ones in the episodes they appear in. I think the admission to fellow companion Dan of her feelings is fairly well handled. I think the scene between Yaz and the Doctor in Legend of the Sea Devils is one of the only good scenes in that episode. And I actually find the final scene between the two of them in Power of the Doctor fairly touching. That having been said, the introduction of this, first of all, not the first time a companion has had a crush on the Doctor. It happened with Rose Tyler. It happened with Martha Jones. It happened with Amy Pond. It arguably happened with Clara when it was the 11th Doctor. This is a thing that was never a thing in classic era, but it became a semi-staple of things since the revival. All that having been said, this still marks a bit of a milestone, a same-sex attraction between companion and Doctor, and... okay. This is another case, as with the forums, I have to go with a certain amount of, trust me, bro, my major criticism ultimately boils down to the fact that this was not planned from early on. If you were actually going to build this kind of relationship, I think if you were ever going to have a prayer of doing it well, you should be doing it on purpose, and they didn't. And if you want to know the basis by which I am saying that, well, when I went to the Doctor Who Convention Gallifrey 1 in 2022, Mandip Gill, who played Yaz, was on a panel that I watched and was asked a few questions, including, at what point did she know that Yaz had a crush on the Doctor? And her answer was, she knew when she got the script for Eve of the Daleks. Which means that it was not in the scripts prior to that. Now, were there fans reading into the possibility of that relationship? Well, yeah, shipper's gonna ship. But there really appears to have been no real intentionality from any earlier point from Chris Chibnall, who was writing it. Because if Mandip Gill didn't know for certain that that was what was going on with Yaz until the script for Eve of the Daleks was in her hand, that means one of two things happened. Either Chibnall had intended to go that direction the whole time and was maybe putting little hints here and there, but never bothered to tell the actors, which means they're not playing it as if it is building towards a relationship because it's not in the scripts they're being given. Or he just looked at the engagement from shippers and thought, oh, actually, that's not a bad idea. I'll have that, and we'll go ahead and do that, which... I'm not saying there's no good things to be done from taking ideas that you see milling about the fandom, but doing it that late and having it really only come up in 3 episodes, it feels tacked on. And just like you're trying to please certain fans. As with most things, my major criticism is with Chibnall and his writing and his approach to the writing. But yeah, it is frustrating to me that I feel very comfortable saying that that relationship was mishandled. Whether it was a case of not letting your actors know what the hell you're doing or a case of just tacking it on at the end, and I'm inclined to think it's the latter. But in either case, that's not great. Before we get to the newest era of Doctor Who, I am going to stop and mention one specific aspect from a Big Finish audio, and that is the July 2020 release of Lovecraft Invasion, featuring, so far as I am aware, the first canonical non-binary human character of Calypso Jones. Now, I specify non-binary human character because there had been alien creatures that were some variants of non-binary since, well, heck, back in the 70s with the third Doctor, John Pertwee. In the episode Curse of Peladon, you had this exchange about the character of Alpha Centauri.
Or is he a she?
Neither. She's an it. It's a hermaphrodite hexapod.
So non-binary or genderless aliens were already a thing, but having a non-binary human character is kind of a big deal because it's not filtering non-binary representation through the artificial lens of an alien species or an allegory. It's just letting them exist. That does matter. Now that brings us to the latest era, the return of Russell T Davies, and also the return of David Tennant as the 14th Doctor, with the Doctor revisiting an old face. Now, in the first of the specials to star this particular incarnation, we meet the character of Rose Noble, Donna's trans daughter. Actually, more specifically, non-binary trans feminine daughter. Now, I do have some of my own personal gripes about the ways that Rose's exact identity was communicated, because it really seemed like the fact that she is some degree of non-binary, even though she is femme-presenting and appears to use she, her pronouns, that is slipped in almost like it's a twist towards the back end, and that just still feels very awkward to me. I say that as someone who is trans femme non-binary. Like, that's me! But it still felt a little bit awkward. That having been said, having an enjoyable, wonderful, caring character that is trans, and yes, also to some degree non-binary, again, not fully explored, but that is there as well. And to be played by a trans actress in addition to that is a really lovely thing to see.
Because the Doctor's male and female.
And neither. And more.
And from there, we reach Ncuti Gatwa. And Gatwa himself is openly identifying as queer. We do not know anything more specific than that. That is all he has chosen to identify as at this point. And honestly, prying any more deeply into that to be like, well, wait, does that mean non-binary? Does it mean gay? Does it mean bisexual? Does it mean... If he doesn't want to tell you, that's none of your damn business. The man is queer. That is the word he uses, and is the word that I will use to describe him as well. But that means we have our first openly queer actor playing the Doctor. Does that mean the Doctor himself is queer? Maybe? One could argue there might be a certain amount of coding in the way that Gatwa is choosing to play the Doctor, but I don't really feel like leaping into that if the show doesn't feel like making it an explicit thing that the Doctor himself is queer. And this is your reminder that I filmed this before this happened. So maybe not so much an open question now. I mean, the Doctor is queer insofar as the Doctor, by nature of being a Time Lord, is inherently gender fluid. And that was true even before the Doctor became a woman. And no, I'm not even talking about the entire Timeless Child thing where we find out that the youngest version of the Doctor that we are currently aware of was also a woman and has been a woman for at least a decent stretch of time previously, because we met the fugitive Doctor played by Joe Martin. But the very notion of Time Lords changing gender was introduced even before any of that, even before the normally masculine character of the Master was reincarnated as Missy, played by Michelle Gomez, who I love. But even before that, we had an episode where the Doctor referenced a character we've never seen called the Corsair, and mentioning that this was a Time Lord who at some points was man, and at some points was woman.
Mark of the Corsair, fantastic bloke. He had that snake as a tattoo in every regeneration. Didn't feel like himself unless he had the tattoo, or herself a couple of times. Woo-hoo!
And that's simply a fact of Time Lords. They are gender fluid by default, which does mean that, yeah, the Doctor is queer. How you feel like parsing that, or whether or not you want to argue over whether specific incarnations have certain attractions, or whether specific incarnations have any attractions at all. I'd actually say there's a good argument to be made that a decent number of incarnations of the Doctor are probably asexual.
Well, you're a beautiful woman, probably.
More so in the classic era than the modern, but still.
There's a strange man in my bedroom.
Yes, there is.
Where anything could happen.
No. So is Doctor Who gay? Yeah! Doctor Who, the show, has had gayness in it explicitly since at least 2005. And implicitly, long before that, and has had gayness as a part of its DNA from the people working on it from literally the very first episode ever made. Am I going to go so far as to say the show is inherently a queer show? That almost feels like it's maybe getting a little gatekeepy about it, but Queerness has been here in some way, shape, or form. Has it gotten more explicit as time has gone on? Has it taken a long time to reach the Doctor as a character now that we have an openly queer actor playing the part? Yeah, that took a while. But gayness, queerness is not a sudden thing that Doctor Who is suddenly doing because of agenda. Doctor Who has been explicitly home to various kinds of queer representation since the introduction of Jack Harkness. And it has had implicit representation for decades before that. So people who want to shout that it's woke and that this is all the result of diversity hires and forced representation, if that's what you think, you shouldn't even know what the show is. If you ever cared, you should have stopped watching in 2005. And if you didn't, and you're still watching, and you're making your living claiming this nonsense, you don't know the show. You just don't. You have such a narrow-minded view of what you think this show either is or should be that I just feel bad for you. Because Doctor Who is weird and strange and bizarre and fanciful and thought-provoking. And it's also pretty gay. Queerness in Doctor Who. Was there anything that I didn't mention that you would have liked me to? Was there anything I mentioned that you didn't know or that surprised you? Whatever the case is, I hope you're having a good Pride Month regardless. Drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills. Enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, subscribe. Those all help me out. Don't worry too much about it, though. What I really want you to remember, especially during Pride, you are beautiful. You are valid. And you are loved. You are the council. I am just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Goddess Elida, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Jean Foray, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Linda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Renabulax the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Kasparov, Dave Hall, Quite Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Toku Bluhuvian, Pal Barabajagal, and Mara G. If you'd like to hear your name in the credits or even just see them, there are rewards on the Patreon, so maybe check those out.